Charlie! Lola? Charlie! Charlie and Lola! I would like to actually keep it.
I have this little sister Lola.
All very cosy and warm.
She's small
It's like a nest.
and very
With a pencil
funny.
case.
Lola, what are you talking to?
Foxy, of course. Hello, Charlie.
Hello, Foxy. Lola really loves her toy fox.
You are the most loveliest fox ever.
She plays with him every day.
There, all smashed up for you. Don't let your egg go all freezing and cold, Foxy. Can you do some more pushing, Foxy? Now, Foxy, we can count sheep. 1, 2, 3, 5.
A family in space.
No, Charlie. It goes Space Family Hudson, family in space. Oh, no! Charlie!
What is it?
It's an actual rabbit. It's an actual rabbit on the path. Just left.
It's a toy rabbit.
How did the rabbit get here on the path? It looks so lonely.
Somebody must have dropped it.
Oh, no. But we can't leave it here. I'm going to take it into school. Then we can ask everybody if they've lost an actual rabbit. Because it's dreadfulish to lose a rabbit.
The best thing is if we put it on the wall. Then whoever lost it would see it when they come back looking for it.
Oh, okay, Charlie. Come on, Lola.
Come on, Lola.
I'm still slightly worrying about the rabbit, Lotta. I'm sure someone will come and get him. He might already be at home by now. What if he isn't? What if he's still there on the wall, all by himself, on his own, all lonely? Aww. Let's check. Yes.
What's the matter, Lola?
Well, I'm worrying about the rabbit. He's still there. He must be very extremely lonely. What if a ginormous bird swoops down and flies off with him? Or a bat. Yes, a bat. And takes him to the moon. Or a big, huge cave where nobody could hear him crying. Oh.
He's too big for a bird to carry off, Lola. And bats only come out at night time. All right, if he's still here when it's home time, we can take him home. Until we find his owner, okay?
Charlie! He's still here!
Come on then, let's take him home.
Oh, I'll take him, because I've got my special bag nest. Hello, rabbit. I'm putting you in my bag. Be very careful. Make sure I can breathe.
It is a toy rabbit, Lotta.
But how would we find out who Rabbit belongs to?
I've got an idea. We can take pictures of him and put them on lots of posters with our phone number at the bottom. Then, if the owner sees him on the poster, they can ring us and come and collect him.
He looks nice.
Then Mum and Dad and Lola and Marv and Lotta and me put the posters up all over the place.
There. So, now what do we do?
We wait for the rabbit owner to call us.
Has anybody called yet?
Lola, we've only just got back.
Don't worry, Rabbit. We will find your home. Do you think Rabbit Toner is a boy or a girl?
I don't know.
Because if it's a girl, we think she would look slightly like me.
Maybe.
And do you think that she likes Rabbit as much as I do, Charlie?
Hello?
Hello, Charlie. It's Lotta.
Oh.
Has anybody rang about Rabbit yet?
No, not yet.
Lola, you have to get off the telephone. Somebody might be calling.
Oops, sorry. Bye.
Somebody will call soon, won't they, Charlie?
I'm sure they will.
Boing, boing. I'm a good jumper. Yes, you are. Let's have a race. Charlie, will you race with Foxy? And I'll race with Rabbit.
Lola.
Please.
Okay.
Here you go. Come on, Charlie. Rabbit's a very big jumper. Boing,
Jump,
boing.
jump, jump.
No! Foxy can't jump. He just runs.
Oh, okay. But you know Foxy will win.
No, he won't.
On your marks. Get set. Go.
Boing,
Ooh.
boing.
And Rabbit takes the lead, jumping over the hedge. Woo! But Foxy makes it over too. Rabbit leaps the wall. I'm catching up.
Boing, boing.
Splash. Swim, swim, swim. Here comes Foxy. He overtakes. Oh no, how will Foxy ever get over this?
Wee, boing.
Oh. But Foxy is quick. He might still catch her.
Rabbit is actually a very fast and a very clever rabbit. I don't know why somebody hasn't called for him. There. Lovely.
Rabbit does have big teeth, doesn't he?
All the better to eat you with. It's been ages. What if no one calls ever? What will we do then, Charlie?
Then I guess you can keep the rabbit.
Really?
But that's not going to happen, Lola, because someone will call. Maybe tomorrow. Night-night.
Night, Charlie. Night, Foxy. Night, Rabbit.
Huh? Lola?
Now, if you eat up your cereal, it will give you lots of energy to hop, 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 hoppity-dop.
Mum says we can put up more posters in the park. Remember, Lola, Rabbit isn't yours to keep. Someone else owns him, and we need to find out who.
I know that, Charlie, actually. I'm only playing with him. Lovely Rabbit.
This is a good place. There. Come on. Just a few more.
Got it.
Hurry up, Lola.
Coming!
There. Yes. Lola, what are you doing?
Nothing?
Come on.
I want Hoppy.
Where is he? Where's my rabbit? Race it to the slide.
Hoppy! It's Hoppy! Oh no! Dad, look, it's Hoppy. It's Charlie! We have to go home now. Mum says our tea's ready.
But we've only just got here.
Come on!
Cheer up, Lola. I'm sure someone will call soon.
I know.
I know. Why don't we play racing again?
No thanks, Charlie. I'm not in the mood.
I'll get it. Hello? Yes, that's right, Blue. We found him near the school gates. Okay, bye. Hey, Lola! That was the owner of the rabbit. It belongs to a little boy. He's coming with his dad to pick it up.
Oh,
Why aren't you pleased?
are you really sure he owns Rabbit?
Yes, positive.
But I really like Rabbit.
But you see, Lola, it isn't your rabbit.
But I think he really likes it here with Foxy and me.
But the little boy who owns him wants him back. How would you feel if you lost Foxy? No one to look after or play with or look after you.
I wouldn't like it.
Come on. Hello.
Hoppy, look, it's Hoppy.
Go on, Lola.
I absolutely looked after him for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Dad, it's Hoppy. That's okay.
Well done, Lola. He was really happy.
Yes, he was really happy because I looked after his rabbit really well.
Yep.
And I let Rabbit sleep in my bed with Foxy.
Uh-huh.
So I will miss him.
Yes.
But Foxy won't.
Why not?
What's that, Foxy? Because Foxy said Rabbit always took too much of the duvet.